You know, I just love watching Bob and listening to Bob deliver a presentation. So I guess our tax paying money went well to the armed forces in training these general officers. Anyway, where's Dawn Wright Perry from Millbank? Where is she? Dawn, where are you? Why are you hiding in the back? Because you knew that I said I was going to mention you? Oh, really? Okay. Well, congratulations to Dawn. She actually refer a friend to get more people to come to the event, to help grow the event. In fact, we have 25% more new attendees this year. She won a 40-inch flat screen, high def. Well, I guess her husband probably has it now. He's probably hijacked it. So, but congratulations, Dawn. One of the things I'll probably You'll probably hear me repeat myself. It's something I can't overcome, but I'm going to say it now. I'm going to probably say it throughout the event. This is your event, okay? We can't sit there, and Andrea and her forum committee, as they plan this event, which the planning next year starts Friday, by the way. They can't figure out what it is, you know, that you guys want to hear, what you want to see, what we want to dive into, what we want to focus on. So please, please fill out your surveys, okay? Because again, it's your event. So next, you're gonna like this. I'd like to introduce Mr. Andrew White, who's a Vice President of Research for Gartner. He's got extensive background in supply chain management, ERP, multi-collaboration. And in 2006, Andrew won the Gartner Thought Leadership Award. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew White from Gartner.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very thankful to join you today. As you can tell, after about 15 seconds of speaking, I don't come from these parts. I actually live in Atlanta, which also doesn't quite add up, but I moved over from the UK about 15 years ago. They told me that it doesn't rain as much as London, it's generally warmer, and they have a lot more barbecues, and that was all I needed to know. I now have a house, 3 boys, a mortgage the size of Mars, cars and cats and dogs and goldfish and everything else, so I'm not moving anytime soon. I've been a Gartner analyst for about 9 years, and I've actually worked in some of the standards bodies. I'll share some of my experiences as we go. But before I was an analyst, I worked for a software vendor for 9 years based in Atlanta and also some parts in the UK, and focused primarily on supply chain. I worked for a company called Logility, part of an old ERP vendor called American Software, and I worked with consumer goods, distribution, manufacturing type companies, trying to help them forecast, anticipate customer, retail, consumer demand. So I focus on business applications, forecasting, distribution requirements, planning, those kinds of applications, and I was always beholden to the quality of the data in those applications as a vendor. And before that, I was a user. I actually lived in the UK in the real world as a user, like yourselves, and actually implementing such systems and using them. I've never worked in IT. Gartner hasn't figured that out yet. And of course, Gartner is known for IT research, but I spend most of my time at home when I'm not allowed out to meet people, and I speak to customers on the phone talking about data. So the odd thing about this whole conversation that we're going to spend 40, 50 minutes talking about is that even though my background's supply chain and business processes and business applications and working on the business side, I'm now, perhaps the pinnacle of my career, I hope not, but at least I'm now talking about data. Everything comes back to data. And as Bob was going through his presentation, I sort of made two phrases that came to mind to try to wrap up some of the things he was saying. I wrote down in front of me here, it's all about the data, it's all about the value. The data we're talking about, I don't think the data on its own is a source of differentiation. I don't think it's a barrier to sharing large amounts of information in a community-based environment. The experience I have working with users is that it's the business process that provides a differentiation. So trying to separate what we do with data and how I use the data is a great way to get over some of the barriers about where should the data reside, who should author it, how should I share it, where should I synchronize it with. So I think it's all about the data. That's what we're talking about today, standards, etc., etc. But it's really, at the end of the day, who gets value from this data? Which business process works better? Which business process is unique? And trying to separate those two sometimes helps in making progress in this conversation. last part on the introduction piece. As I say, I spend most of my time on the phone talking with end users. I talk about master data management, MDM, master data management. This is a new acronym. Sometimes you think you get paid to invent acronyms. It's not quite as simple as that, but because of my travels as a vendor and as a user, I was focused on, as I said, consumer goods distribution, and I used to go to standards meetings, some of those things that Bob talked about, you know, those kind of like coffee and donut kinds of meetings when you sit there with reams of XML and committees arguing about what to call what field and so on and so forth. My experiences with something called CPFR, Collaborative Planning, Forecasting and Replenishment. Back in 98, 99, Walmart, Kmart at the time, Home Depot, HP, Staples, Gillette, P&G, they were focused on how to collaborate better on new product introduction and how to collaborate to reduce or to improve in-store availability. And the prerequisite we discovered was that the data underpinning these collaborative business processes, these shared business processes, the data was the weak link. They could implement a one-off customized business process. Anybody can do that. But to try to build a formalized mechanism that could be repeated was extremely difficult. And worse, the data P&G would send Walmart before Global Data Sync happened was rubbish. There was no single definition of product data in the Procter & Gamble systems anywhere. There were 38 versions of product. Marketing people had information on their laptops. You know, corporate data was kept in the corporate systems. It was all over the place. Salespeople, category managers, they just didn't have the data in the right place. On the other hand, when some bright spark actually did get the data together, the retailers couldn't use it because their internal applications were completely shot to pieces. There was no single place to put it in for all the applications to get it. They were disconnected, spaghetti integration, you know it very well. And so Global Data Sync became sort of I'll use the word epiphany, we've already heard it once today, but it really was an aha, wow, if we could just get the underlying core boring data synchronized between buyer and seller, the rich business processes that companies really wanted to get value from could take place. And so I bumped into UCCnet, Uniform Code Council, and the original Global Data Sync initiative. I bumped into it as part of that standards organization, and I used to go to those meetings, and I had so much fun. I learned so much about business. I also learned so much about people. Watching these organizations from, you know, with buyers and sellers collaborate, cooperate, I sort of came up with the term collaborate. How did they actually, you know, twist each other's arms to work together to try to come up with agreement and metrics, etc., etc. So it's a great learning experience, but I basically realized that data's the problem. And so when I joined Gartner a few years later, I was at a conference, I was leaning against a post in a hotel, not unlike this one, and I was leaning up there sort of listening to some guy talk, and I was sort of getting bored. And then there's another guy around the corner of the post from Gartner, and I introduced myself, and he introduced himself. I said, what do you do? He asked me what I do. I said, I focus on product data, product information management. This was the P&Gs were trying to pull product and marketing data together before they can send it to Walmart. And he said, well, that's funny. I talk about customer data, and I talk about banks and insurance companies and organizations trying to achieve single version of the truth for customer. And we work at Gartner, we get paid lots of money to look for patterns, and we discovered a pattern. So we called it master data management. It's not a new phrase, we just sort of gave it capitals. And suddenly MDM became a real thing. And this is just, you know, a few years ago, and yet the problem of inconsistent data is older than we are. We've had it for years in our businesses. It's been eating away at our ability to perform. Finally, we have a name, we have a presentation, and we have sort of a market. This is a technology-enabled market. So master data management for me started with product information management. Product information management is a desire for an organization to come up with a single golden copy of product data in preparation to share it with somebody else, and also a willingness to receive that data and use it for benefit, for value in some fashion. That's what PIM started out, and we sort of elevated it to a broader conversation. If you're a distributor or you're a manufacturer, you have customers, of course, both of you have customers, and customer data is another form of master data, product data, location. It turns out hierarchy data You use those in reporting systems. If you look at the lenses through which management analyzes the numbers, how are we performing? That's a hierarchy. That's a master data object. So MDM was born, and here I am today. You wouldn't have me here otherwise, so that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 30-odd minutes. Just by way of introduction, one of the, there's many ways to start this conversation. A humorous particular anecdote is in front of you here. A number of years ago, in 1964, an American was visiting London. He fell in love with a particular bridge. This may be familiar to some of you folks. He fell in love with a particular bridge he saw in London. It was the bridge at the bottom, which is a very well-known bridge. I'm sure you've seen that picture before, often goes with Big Ben quite well. Actually, that bridge is called Tower Bridge. That's its proper name. However, the locals in London refer to it as London Bridge because that's what every foreigner assumes it is, and so we just say, yeah, that's London Bridge, yeah, it's the bridge, it's the main bridge we all look at. Of course, there are many bridges along the Thames. And this American fell in love with the lower bridge, the Tower Bridge, and unfortunately he actually placed an order, if you will. He spoke to the right folks who own the bridge, London Bridge, and unfortunately the bridge that turned up was the bridge you see in the top picture. It was actually moved brick by brick on a large number of ships over to the US and rebuilt, and unfortunately it's the wrong one. So consistency in understanding, to be precise, semantic consistency is really what we're talking about. I mean, it's a pretty techie kind of thing, and that's really what we have to be, is be fairly precise. So when we talk about nuts and bolts, when we talk about electrical components, when we talk about bridges or boxes of chocolates or Heineken, one of my favourite tipples, we have to be very precise over what type of thing we're talking about. And how do we do that? Rich attributed information. And so clearly it's a somewhat humorous example. There are many others where inconsistency in data can harm business. There are examples in other industries where it can actually be rather unhelpful for life, as it were. So we're going to look very quickly at three particular areas. The first one I'm going to breeze through quickly, because I'm pretty sure you guys are up to speed on what is master data. What is interesting is that every company will have a different set of master data. If you were a manufacturer of Heineken, just imagine you were. I can taste it right now. If you were a manufacturer of Heineken, you sell to retailers, you sell to distributors, you sell, products, and so for that type of company, customer data, product data is obvious. If you think of the government, the federal government, taxation, hate that word, well, single view of citizen and tax code is their kind of master data. I noticed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago, the federal government have just issued a new master list of injury and healthcare codes that all hospitals around the country will now have to use to identify and classify the injury or the illness that you suffer. It used to be like 12,000 classification. It's now 140,000 codes. It's just been issued. How on earth the healthcare industry is going to cope with this and change all their internal systems that identifies I broke this bone, I fell off a chair, or blah, blah, blah. It's 140,000 different things we can now have as a disease. So master data is very different for the type of organization we're talking about. But I'll breeze through that very quickly. We believe that master data management, which is a discipline to manage single version of the truth, is key to business and IT. Quick question, just to waken you up a little bit. I won't throw any balls at you. There are a couple here, but I won't. I'm left-handed. As if that were interesting. It probably is. How many of you, I'm assuming most of you, the majority are from business. Hands up if you're from the business side versus IT. If you're from the business. If you're from IT. 20% IT. So I spend, when I started this research, it was mostly all business, because we didn't have a name for it. PIM was still sort of small and unknown, and IT wasn't even in the conversation. Nowadays it's formalized, it's written about, many people talk about the same thing. Now IT's having the same conversation, so that's a really great mix. But we think it's central to how IT supports the business strategy. It's central to applications and so on and so forth. And then lastly, how do companies actually start this particular journey? The first couple of slides, what is master data? This is just a set of slides from a tutorial that we share and hold in our own summits. You see at the top right-hand side a kind of representation of structured information in a relational table. We see, to be precise, actual data, the item codes, the descriptions, the categories, the classifications, whatever set of attributes that you need to uniquely identify one product or part from another. You also see metadata, just to really show you I know something about IT. Metadata is the stuff that describes the data. So combined, you need the metadata describing the information and the actual data to describe the physical object on the left. Nothing special. The colors highlight a very interesting concept that a lot of companies struggle with: ownership. Who is the author of this attributed information? Who is the person to go to when there's a problem with it? Who is the authority? This is something that companies struggle with. Our applications that we've implemented don't help us here. So we have to do something called governance. And governance is painful. It's almost as bad as a frontal lobotomy, or maybe having that fourth child or something. So we have to worry about ownership, and this hints at workflow. How does the data processes span our organizations? The master data itself, as you can see, has to be consistent and uniform. It has to be, it rarely changes. It's fairly rigid. It doesn't mean we don't have product changes, of course we do, but the definition that we've stuck with is the one that we're going to work with, and it's widely reused. Most of the core business processes, most of the business applications we use this data. So it's that set of attributes that appears across our business everywhere we go. That is the kind of master data we're talking about. And our problem, collectively, is that companies have spent millions on ERP systems, millions on business intelligence, millions on data integration, data quality, and we still don't have single version of the truth. And so master data management, the thing I'm talking about here, which is like PIM, but a little bit broader, includes PIM, has to start somewhere. We can't solve world hunger, but if we start by defining and governing just the core attributes, and using that to drive things like global data sync or synchronizing with our manufacturing partners, and upon which we establish governance and stewardship, data quality, security, etc., then we can start to synchronize the added rich data. Then we can start to synchronize those business processes for differentiation. So it's a series of maturity steps that we're really talking about. So master data is a consistent uniform set of identifiers and attributes that are widely reused across the enterprise. It's widely reused in many places. It helps selling to organizations, selling to customers. The information is used in applications to help you identify who you're selling to, how well are you selling. It helps you measure what we're doing as well as actually sell, but measure. This is the business intelligence kind of stuff. And it can help you with internal effectiveness. How can we streamline our internal processes? It can help with procurement. It could help with fulfillment, warehousing, shipping. All those kind of processes consume the data. If that data is inconsistent, we have to integrate it, which means we spend more money, which means we have less money to innovate and seek innovation in our business, which is really what we need to do, rather than worry about the basic boring stuff. So data is used everywhere. It's used in customer-facing applications. It's used in business intelligence, data warehousing. It's used in ERP, supply chain. Every company has the same problem. Every company has the same problem. And this is one of the wrinkles of data synchronization. Both parties have to be at a certain level of readiness. Both parties have to be able to measure a value in order to do it. I've spent too long on a phone with a company on one side of the relationship from the global data sync kind of side, where somebody was ready, nobody wanted to receive, couldn't use the data. So I spent all that money investing in the thing, nobody's going to use it. Versus, I want the data now, well, I'm not ready, or I send you bad data. You've both got to be at the same level. Somehow you've got to measure that maturity. You've got to somehow have a readiness assessment that says, yes, I'm ready to go to step A, step B, step C. Then you can start to turn on the floodgates and synchronizing that kind of data. One other thing you have to think about in this thing called master data management, this hot new thing, to solve a very old problem, is that I'm only talking about master data. I'm so lucky I get to say no. Customers phone me every day and say, I want to talk about global data sync, I want to talk about electronic data and product catalogs, I want to talk about PIM, I want to talk about retail, I want to talk about this data, that data. I say, no, all I do is master data. All I have is the key, that's all I focus on, is the key to open up the bigger conversation of synchronizing all this other stuff. If you try to synchronize everything on day one, you'll be as old and as grey as we've been for years. We need to get some progress, and that means we've got to put a boundary around what we do and focus on the small stuff first and then build it up to the bigger stuff. So application-specific data is the data that's out of scope. If you have key business process, one specific business process that requires a set of attributes, that's not master data. The definition was it's widely reused. So if it's not widely reused, it's out of scope. This helps you narrow what you're doing, helps you make progress, helps you get started, because you focus on a limited set of data early on. So application-specific data and master data are similar, but they're not necessarily the same thing. An example would be units of measure. Tricky one. Units of measure I would call a reference data. We've defined that as reference data. You sometimes need to master units of measure in order to define product. So mastering reference data might in fact be your first port of call before you start to synchronize and govern the master data itself. So classifying the data you're focused on is a very important step in the work we're doing here. And as you know, at the end of the day, we're really trying to focus on rich data, the graphics, the unstructured data on the right side of the chart. We're not just focused really on the limited set of attributes, but we have to start somewhere. And this highlights this sort of iterative, Bob described this sort of like from a development perspective, an iterative, cyclical, how many other long words can I think of early in the morning? You know, it's like a repetitive cycle that gets broader and broader of the type of data we're governing, we're centralizing, stewarding, assuring, etc., and then eventually synchronizing with our trading partners. And I mentioned already that there are different types of data. My life was product data. I worked with product type companies. My partner in crime, John Ratcliffe, focused on customer data. And back those few years ago, we went out into the wider world and thought this MDM thing was going to be applicable, and we found out it was. Every other company, every public company, private company of any size that's heterogeneous, that's a key thing, has a complicated application landscape. You can bet your bottom dollar or euro, whichever's worth the most these days, and figure out they don't have single definition of the truth. They spend too much time integrating, too much time building reports, and so they don't have governance and stewardship, and so there is a huge opportunity for governing this kind of data. And so trying to understand the set of master data is a big challenge that organizations have to address fairly early on. And because I come from Global Data Sync, that's where I started, I realized very early, whereas John and his customer data banking thing was sort of one particular area of the economy, on product data, Global Data Sync, we've discovered that the data persists everywhere. And it's interesting, Bob mentioned that the data warehouse, the platform, isn't really a PIM, it's a light PIM. This is a very interesting angle to explore, and we're still researching it. Really, where the data resides is not that important. I've had a small number of calls from very large organizations who've concluded, after spending millions of trying to do this stuff, managing PIM, after spending millions of trying to get PIM right, they've just asked themselves, hang on a minute, most of this data exists out there on the web anyway. I'm not the original author of much of this data. The suppliers are providing data, the customer might provide extra data that tells me the preferences they have. My trading partners provide partnering kind of data. So why am I actually governing this stuff myself? Why don't I just turn off these internal systems and point our applications outward, using one of those graphics that Bob had with the circle and the data outside? So why are we actually focused on this governing thing inside when most of the data resides outside? And this is where we're thinking with cloud computing, there's some other dynamics coming down the road that says maybe we don't need to think of our ERP systems as the godfather of data. Maybe they're just a slave. It'd be nice to make ERP a slave rather than the slave that we are to it. So it's an interesting thought. If the data today cycles through multiple layers of a supply chain, distributors, manufacturers, and in other industries through retail, manufacturing, etc. If the data is common and it needs to be consistent, where's the most appropriate place to store it and govern it? It's not a source of differentiation on its own, remember. It's the process, it's how we use it that provides a differentiation. So some companies are beginning to think about turning off the efforts inside their firewall and finding better ways to work together to govern the authority model, to be precise, outside the firewall. And that's really long term where we're going. It ain't going to happen tomorrow. It ain't going to happen tomorrow. It may not happen next week, but it's something that we're beginning to think about, and long term it's very, very exciting with this cloud kind of stuff that's coming along. Interest in master data management, as you know, because you're focused on the product data and PIM, there are many reasons why you'd be interested in it. So we've just talked about what it is, what are the drivers, what's the interest that's driving interest in PIM and master data management for product data and customer data. I mentioned struggling with heterogeneous systems. Most of us have heterogeneous systems. despite our investments in Oracle applications and SAP applications, we still have very large heterogeneous systems, despite what the sales rep told us. In fact, we are a very distributed group of people. Our organizations thrive on the fact that we're all different, and our internal applications actually can be a source of differentiation because they're all different and provide different capabilities. Our data should not be any different. But those applications have to work together. We have to work across organizational boundaries, department boundaries, business unit boundaries, and if we don't have that single definition at the underpinning it, we might end up with the wrong London Bridge, the wrong Tower Bridge. So the more heterogeneous we are, the more likely we have a problem, and the more likely the interest in this type of this PIM and MDM is going to be. Compliance and risk management in some industries, healthcare, food, these are big issues in financial services. There's all kinds of regulations, the Patriot Act. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in many industries requiring thou shalt assure this kind of data that requires good, clean, consistent, governable master data at the center of it. Process optimization, performance effectiveness. If you're trying to sell more and you've got a CRM initiative, if you're trying to use Salesforce.com, you're trying to analyze what your customers are buying from you, you've got to have good, clean, consistent definition of customer, the transaction and the product data underpinning those things. If you don't have it, then the data you're pulling together in the warehouse is not going to be trusted. And we all know what that means. So companies focus, customer-oriented companies who sell products and services are very interested in MDM to help get more value from their CRM implementation, from their Salesforce.com implementation, from their marketing systems implementation, etc., etc. The data is the DNA that drives those business processes. Service-oriented architecture, just to show you something to keep the IT folks awake. You know, if you have a big IT strategy focused on agility and service orchestration, which really means to business people, rapid applications. When I want to change the process, IT can deliver it quickly. We would call that SOA, simply, to make things easier to integrate. It's all about solving the data problem. If we can solve that data problem, it makes the SOA strategy much more interesting. And there are other reasons, but certainly the big drivers are revenue, service, cost optimization, if you're trying to streamline internal processes, gain leverage with your suppliers. Again, good, clean, consistent view of part, product, classification, and supplier is critical. So there's many drivers, and as the economy fluctuates, these drivers come and go as popular. When the economy is growing, it's all about revenue and new markets and new products. When the economy is tanking, it's all about cost optimization, streamlining. So MDM is job for life, believe me. It's going to be, we're going to be talking about this forever. We may change the acronym, but it's still going to be the same problem as we go forward. I get calls from customers asking me who's successful. We host a summit in the US once a year and in Europe once a year, and we have about 6 or 7 end user organizations presenting their war stories. Nobody is complete. We've had some very large organizations present their implementations. Cisco, for example, huge single version of truth for customer. We've had ABB talking about products and part data for a global organization. We've had something smaller, nearer to home, 1-800-Flowers. We should always know 1-800-Flowers, always a time for flowers, of course. My wife reminds me every week. But they sell their products through multiple different brand names, and for efficiency purposes, reporting and sourcing, they need single version of the truth for product data. So it's amazing the different areas that pop up. Damon is a branding company. They don't sell anything except knowledge, but they work with consumer goods manufacturers and help them with their brand marketing through retail. So they take product data and brand data and figure out a better way to use it to communicate through the retail channel. So there's many different scenarios. I mentioned, you know, different forms of government. I spend too much time with federal and state government authorities. Oh my gosh. It's unbelievable. But I mean, they have problems. Single view of citizen, single view of patient, single view of physician, single view of child welfare. It's unbelievable. It's a universal problem. So the key point is, it's a process. It changes the way we manage data. It's not like order management that you implement. It changes the way the business creates the data so that it can be reused, leveraged, and therefore the business processes are kind of like freed up. We can now sort of change the processes. We don't have to worry about the data problem. So these companies are examples of companies doing this, and even Walmart have multiple different kinds of MDM components. They don't have a unified strategy. The Army doesn't have a unified strategy for weapon, material, and medical supplies. There's multiple different initiatives trying to get single version of the truth across different forces all over the place. And it's not US, this is a global type of thing. So the characteristics of success are all about value. There's business value to be measured and realized, and it's not actually about the data. Master data management, product information management. The only reason we're doing these things is because the business process is the point. Because we can increase or improve or optimize what we do with the data. The data is not the point of it. It's just the enabling thing to get to the next stage. And these companies have recognized that. They've got business sponsors. They're doing it off and doing great things. So why must it be part of your business and IT strategy? Or why would it be part of IT strategy supporting the business? 3 slides, nothing special. Probably the most, I suppose it might look like a technical conversation, but it isn't really technical. The point here, for those of you that know something about the acronyms on the left-hand side, CRM, Customer Relationship Management, ERP, Supply Chain, I'll throw in PLM, Procurement, SRM. These are large application suites. Probably many of you have got ERP, some customer relationship management, some product lifecycle management. You've got these big stacks. They're silos, vertical silos. Application, application logic, user interface, application logic, data, blah, 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 blah. Vertical silos. We've spent 30 years building the graphic on the left. We've put massive walls between these applications, and in IT we integrate. We've created a very slow, lethargic landscape that doesn't respond to change well. We're going to now spend 30 years building the graphic on the right side, which is all about service enablement. We're going to tear down the barriers of ERP. We're going to break it into smaller pieces and make it agile and nimble. These are big trends going on out there in IT. It's what we do in Gartner. We're going to go towards service-oriented architecture. So we're going to have application services, integration services, master data services, and in there will be a little line called PIM services. How do I manage and synchronize and share data almost automatically? That's the goal. So we're going to go from 30 years of vertical silos to the next 30 years, we've only just started, of horizontal services. That's an architectural conversation, and the IT folks in here are probably thinking, yeah, we've been thinking about that, we're doing some of that already. But imagine our entire applications were completely changed to the right side, and the amount of replication and redundancy in the data and the applications go down completely. Massive saving of money on IT, freeing up funds for innovation, supporting the business more differently, etc., etc. So that's sort of the one pseudo architectural conversation for the IT folks. Second graphic really talks about social data. Bob had a couple of slides talking about, Facebook and MySpace and all that stuff. There are companies beginning to now, mostly vendors, users are beginning to explore how to link product and brand sentiment that we are, or these women over 55 perhaps, influencing what's going on, or commercial organizations, gossip, tweets. How do they impact how products are received in the market, and how can I receive that in marketing to influence my launch programs? It's just the start, the cusp of the whole thing. Where does the data reside? Where's the most valuable piece of information coming from? Is it from the guy in marketing, or is it from the girl on Facebook? More of it's going to come from outside the organization. So, and again, if we don't have that sort of single Bible, that single DNA thing at the center, then whatever happens outside in that social network, we won't be able to relate to the business. We'll have to integrate manually. So it's very, very difficult. But social data is going to be a big driver. We've just started, and again, it needs, you need to tie your PIM strategy to some kind of social awareness out into the future. The last slow build is something called big data. Show of hands, anybody heard of big data? Big data is coming to a store near you. It's really an IT thing at the present time, but big data is really a way to describe the massive, it includes really social data, but it includes the huge growth in interest in analytics and information out on the web that we can't cope with in our internal IT systems. And so big data is the third of the big 3 things that are really driving interest in the center of IT, supporting business. For some companies, this is very important. Clearly at the moment for you guys it's a few of you but not rest of you, but maybe in the next year or so you'll be thinking about big data and its role, and how does the central DNA that describes the business that we do, how does that link into everything that's going on outside the organization. You've got the data at the bottom of the chart, the enterprise systems, but everything taking place outside the organization in the future. So lastly, how do you get started? I meet many companies. I'm very lucky. I mean, this is a great job to do, believe me. I meet many companies in very different states of readiness, awareness even. Are we ready? Are we aware of the problem? Do we have, do we admit we have the disease? Some companies focus on business intelligence first. They may focus on a performance management initiative. Some are focused specifically on global data sync. Standards. As Bob was describing, what is a standard? I have customers call up and say, Andrew, do I adopt this standard? And they ask me as if I'm going to have an answer. Yes or no. And so I was trying to think, as Bob was just saying, what is an industry standard? I came up very boring. I came up with two sort of names. Is it permissible violations? If you have a standard, are you allowing violation? Is it a identified rule breaker? I mean, what is the point of standards? For me, from the conversations I've had, it's a way to level set that data thing. Do you remember I said it's all about the data? It's setting that platform upon which we build the value of the business processes for differentiation. So global data sync is really focused on the data, but I think we should be talking about global process sync. I think we need to be thinking about how do those partner values accrue at the business process level. If companies can recognize that and account for it, it motivates the need to synchronize data. So I think that's really where that goes down in the road, goes in the future. Some of you focused on data quality initiatives, some of you focused on operational applications and customer data or ERP. So there's many different places that companies start. And one of the most useful pieces of research we have, because again, very similar, Bob mentioned change management a number of times. And this is not about the technology. Even though I work for Gartner, we're a technology research house. The IT is certainly a challenge for sure. We've got legacy systems, we've got silos, we don't have control of the data. Oh, sure. We know that. The big problems are people, which was the first thing on the list. People, how do we change the way they work together? How do we change the way we reward and recognize their work? Is the root of the problem. So we come up with a sort of a change management framework to help implement and manage the program. It starts off with a vision and a strategy. How does PIM, how does managing data support our business, and how are we going to achieve it in the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? Metrics, how do we measure success? We need metrics. We have to measure how bad stuff is before we start, otherwise you've no idea whether you've made any improvement. You've got to benchmark. We've got to have business metrics dictating what success means. We have to talk about governance, that horrible word. Could be ownership, it could be policies. We've got to talk about who's involved in the business, who's the data steward, and we've got to talk about the business process, the life cycle of the data. Who's the author, who approves, who enriches, who consumes, who abuses, who copies, who abuses again, who copies, who distributes and synchronizes, etc., etc. And lastly, how do we change the technology? So we've got lots of research behind this describing sort of a best practice framework, and I'm sure if you've been implementing your product information management systems, you've done some of this in your work as well already. Last slide here, how to build the business case before I wrap up. This is really this is experience. This is what customers or users have fed back to me. Some companies can't get the business interested in synchronizing data. So one way around this is to collect war stories. Look for business problems, look for major events, look for a major lost account, look for a major customer service problem that you can unearth the root causes data and then expose that to the business. Say, hey, look, we found a root cause analysis of the data that's led to a major account loss, a major customer service problem. If we govern this data differently, if we can govern it as a single definition of the truth and synchronize it, we can improve and resolve this potential issue going forward. So collect war stories is one way and expose the business, expose the wickedness of their ways, if you will. Another way is to identify mission-critical business processes, product introduction, part supersession, The business processes that require trading partner participation feed off the data. So if the business is communicating the priorities, use that to drive your initiative to focus on what data, what master data, etc., etc. And lastly, for the IT folks in the room, if you've got multiple activities touching the item master, bring them together, rationalize the work, and try to use that as a kick point for a PIM or an MDM initiative to manage that product data. So those are just different ways that companies are beginning to start and look for that business case for a PIM and MDM. Last item here, if you don't have a PIM or an MDM strategy, you really ought to. Governing data is the biggest single thing we need to be doing to meet the business strategy. I can't think how else we'd meet that strategy at the level of cost that's acceptable without managing data at the center of it. So it really is a critical item. If you are already implementing an MDM or a PIM implementation, you know, you're kind of an organization as a candidate. If you're preparing to synchronize and you can talk about the value you've got from that type of initiative, you're a great case study speaker for this event, for our summit event. We love to talk to companies, end users that are managing their data, can measure the value they're getting from that measurement and synchronizing with their trading partners. So hopefully that's something that we might be able to talk about in the future. With that, I think I'm pretty much done. I might have a 30 seconds or take one question. If anybody has a burning question, a burning disagreement, or burning agreement, it would be great to hear from somebody. Any? Can you get a copy of my presentation? I'm sure we can arrange something, sir. I'm sure we can do that. That was an easy question, though. Any other questions? I think not. Well, thank you very much for your time.